Thank you, Sean. The next speaker is Amy Vanner, who is an archivist at the State Records of South Australia. She was recently seconded to the Attorney-General's Department as the sole archivist in a multi-business unit records management project, which forms the basis of her conference paper. Say good day to Amy, I hope.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining me today. I'm at the State Records Research Centre at Jepps Cross, just north of Tanganya, Adelaide, on Kaurna land. I acknowledge the Kaurna as the custodians of the Adelaide region and acknowledge that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today. I also pay respects to the cultural authority of Aboriginal people attending from other areas of Australia. I'm Amy Vanner, and I'm a senior archivist at State Records of South Australia. From September 21 to March 2022, I was transferred from State Records to the Attorney-General's Department, reporting to the Manager of Information Management Services to work on the PLUS Records Reduction Project. This project was designed to reduce the amount of physical records stored on site with Planning and Land Use Services, or PLUS, and the offices of the Registrar-General and Valuer-General. For clarity, I will refer to all three as just PLUS. In this presentation, I will give a brief background and overview of the Records Reduction Project, my reflections on the work and its link to the conference theme of Here We Are, and end with a show and tell of some of the interesting pieces accessioned by State Records. I've included several records accessioned by State Records as part of this project on the slides. They don't always relate to exactly what I'll be talking about, they're mostly just for visual interest. The Records Reduction Project was a component of a much larger logistical project of moving PLUS to the new building. PLUS has a very long and complex history dating all the way back to the first Surveyor General, Colonel William Light, who arrived in South Australia in August 1836. The current Surveyor General is based within PLUS as the manager of the Land and Built Environment Directorate, and that role is the longest running senior position in the South Australian government. PLUS joined AGD in 2020 when the Attorney General, Vicky Chapman, was also appointed Minister for Planning and Local Government in a cabinet reshuffle. PLUS was part of the Department for Planning, Transport and Infrastructure, which is now Infrastructure and Transport, and was split between three buildings in the Adelaide CBD. These officers were planning to move to the same building before the MOG changes, and this move was still prepared to go ahead even after PLUS moved departments. The Records Reduction Project was based at Grenfell Street, where the three generals, the Surveyor, Registrar and Valuer, were based. My role on the project was to sentence, box, list and arrange permanent records for transfer to State Records Archive and temporary records to offsite storage. It was a simple enough brief, but my contract was only for 6 months and there were no detailed audits of storage areas, so it was difficult to determine the exact extent of the work needed to be done to clear the building. I made a conservative estimate of 100 record types stored on site in my early visits, and I ended up with over 120 series of permanent records. I was the only archivist on the project, and I had a project support officer who I trained in boxing and listing. AGD and State Records also provided support, as did a small project team from PLUS, made up of representatives from each of the smaller units within PLUS. To streamline and cut down on processing time, I would do the bulk of the processing work usually completed by State Records in the standard transfer process, including series registrations and amendments. I maintained my access to State Records archival management system, Archives1, so I was able to register series myself, and I could also check the AMS for similar records and note the relationships between the series. This was possible because State Records is already a business unit of AGD and the IT systems were the same. By doing most of the processing myself, my role on the project was more research intensive than anticipated. And I anticipated a lot of research, but the project team working on the building move were probably expecting someone to come in, box up their records and then send them away and not spend hours poring over them and then listing them individually and asking lots of questions about them. I wanted to explain what archives are and what archivists do, not just for this project, but in general. PLUS had held on to very old records and most of their current staff hadn't been involved in transfers to State Records before. When explaining the archiving process, I figured out pretty quickly that using jargon and archival terminology wasn't going to get me very far, just like how I didn't understand their technical terminology relating to their work. I didn't use respecte phone once, And not just because I can't really pronounce it properly, but because it wasn't going to be very helpful. Understanding that they had permanent records that were out of the scope of this project that would need to be transferred in the future and without the same level of involvement by state records, I wanted to introduce them to state records and the transfer process. I reported regularly to my manager in AGD, who reported to the project team, and I was often sharing interesting records I'd found, noting any that were particularly old, valuable, or weird, and this one definitely being one of them. These records drew the attention of other PLUS staff, some of whom were surprised to see the records I was finding and others who were very familiar with them, and I hope they enjoyed my enthusiasm for them. I had several comments about some of the older records that they should be in a museum, or people were asking me if I was from a museum or from a library, and then noticing a slight sense of disappointment on their faces when I said that I was from an archive. Of course, I could explain that just because something isn't on display doesn't mean that people can't see it, which is why I was creating finding aids and entries in an online catalogue for it. But I was thinking about those conversations when I read that the ASA conference this year was themed Here We Are. So much of the work that we do as archivists is unseen, but it's not unnoticed. People know when they can't find a record they need for their work or study, and I've spent most of my working life finding those records for people, which is why we create finding aids for them. Most people using an archive will know a good series description from a bad one, but they wouldn't necessarily know what a series means, or what the series system is, or why records are arranged in a particular way, or the work involved in creating those series registrations. I was grappling with that when trying to explain what I was doing with these records, and I hoped that the work I was doing would speak for itself. However, I had to find the balance between clearing out a lot of recent corporate files that were taking up storage space and dedicating the time and attention needed to describing one or two unusual items from the 19th century. A detailed description of a couple of items is probably not going to have the same kind of weight or obvious tangible value than clearing out a whole compactus, even if clearing the compactus took less time than describing those few items. In total, I transferred 4,885 items to 126 series, which is just under 50 linear meters. Everything from corporate files, correspondence dockets, indexes, registers, employee records, photographs, and field books. There are a lot of field books. The records disposal schedule for the agency makes about 90% of their records permanent, plus all records from the South Australian Government created pre-1901 are automatically permanent under a State Records Council ruling. Over half of the series transferred were pre-1901. Over a quarter, 26% of all new series at State Records registered in the 2021-2022 financial year were from this project. There were permanent records left by the time my contract finished, mostly technical records, ones in unusual formats, or ones still used by staff that would not be suitable for transfer. Records have to no longer be in administrative use to be eligible for transfer. In December, just when transfers were hitting their peak, Omicron arrived and caused a few disruptions to the project. By the end of the year, the entire South Australian public sector, except essential workers, were put on working from home orders. I was not deemed essential and was temporarily taken off the project full-time to work from home on other tasks until I was allowed back in the office. The project support officer and I were amongst the first to return in early February. Although we were working in two separate offices, in case one of us went down, we wouldn't be close contacts of each other. While this was a challenge at the time, it wasn't unique to me or to this project, and the unique challenges came from attempting to understand the records and their systems. One of the reasons I wanted to do this project is because lands records are very popular with our researchers. They are some of the most frequently retrieved records in the collection, and they are also amongst our most confusing. They're highly technical. If they're not written in 19th century legal jargon, they're calculations or measurements with very little immediate context. After 6 months, I will honestly say that I still can't interpret most of the calculations. I don't really know the difference between a theodolite and a sextant, but I was given an insight into how these records were used, registered, and arranged, and I hope that their descriptions will be useful to staff and researchers. One of the early project plans developed before I was hired was that the project officer could be based in AGD's main office in the GPO Exchange, which is about a 5-minute walk from the PLUS offices, and a project team run by PLUS's former department, who would be coordinating the building move, could package up the records and send them to the GPO for sentencing. Ultimately, this idea didn't progress, and I was based full-time in PLUS's Grenfell Street offices, which meant I was separated from the AGD team and there were no other staff dedicated to moving records out of the building. But I did have control over which records I worked on and also had easier access to Plus staff who are all experts in their field with that close knowledge of their records that I needed for the series descriptions. The first item I transferred was a master index to various sets of maps and plans known within the office as the Bible. State records were aware of this index and had been trying to get it to the archives for decades. The index was begun in the 1840s. It's heavy, leather-bound, handwritten on vellum, and it provides a gateway to a number of series already in state records custody. The index is still used by Plus to find maps that they need to reference, and while it was in okay physical condition for its age, it is close to 180 years old and needed conservation work to ensure that it would be preserved for future use. As part of the transfer, State Records provided a high-quality digitised copy for internal use at Plus, which we can also use to provide to researchers. This was a special agreement, not part of the usual transfer process, because of the importance of the Bible in helping us to provide access to records we already hold, and also because the book was vellum and needed to be preserved. This arrangement worked very well. We got the original index and we both got high quality copies. As an aside, we don't destroy source records after digitization, so we still have the index. The feedback I received from the staff who worked most closely with the index was very positive. The process was seamless for them. They handed over the index. I did all the descriptions and the logistics in getting the index to the archives, and then they got a copy within a couple of weeks. They were also very impressed with the quality of the copies, which I was able to feed back to the digitisation staff at State Records. I was hoping that this being the first transfer and staff feeling positive about it would set the mode for other transfers. This was mostly the case, but there were certainly a few staff who weren't too pleased that I was coming in and taking all of their old stuff away from them. The older records stored on site were very well preserved, well organised. The staff cared a lot about them and they'd already moved them between buildings several times over the years. They also understood their importance within the context of their own work. While State Records had an interest in these records, which was another reason why I jumped at the chance of working with them, the project came about because they were moving to a new building with limited storage space for inactive records, and not because they wanted to remove records from their custody. What I hoped to do was to promote State Records as the kind of place that would take as good care of the records as they had, that cared about them as much as they did, but could also provide access to members of the public and bring a bit of a broader context to them. I wanted them to trust me and trust State Records with their records. As most staff had never been involved in transfers before, I was starting from scratch, but I started with the jewel in the crown of the Plus collection with the Bible. I focused on older administrative records, mostly 19th century or at least 100 years old. There were over 30 separate sets of indexes and registers, which helped me in understanding a lot of the new series arrangements. Some indexes covered records already in State Records custody as well, which now assist with researchers' access to them. I avoided very technical records, especially ones that required the expertise of surveyors to properly understand. This led to discussions around whether the archives was the most appropriate place for them. If we remove the records from the people who understand them, are we going to be able to create finding aids that explain them as well as someone who has that close knowledge and understanding of them? Which is probably a discussion for another paper. Those very technical records have remained in Plus's custody for now, potentially further discussion down the track. My priorities on the project were based on the State Records Transfer Standard, which prioritises open access records from the 19th century. But I had to balance this with the purpose of the project, reducing on-site records, not just reducing on-site historical records. Towards the end of the project, I worked on younger records, most of which were sent to off-site storage rather than to the archives because they're too young for the standard or because they were restricted from public access. I had several staff package up recently closed records that they'd finished with for me, which was particularly useful in the return to work period of early 2022, where we were actively limiting face-to-face contact with other people. With permission and information from staff, I did transfer several sets of technical surveying records, including field books, observation books, and sketchbooks. Some of these books were first identified by George Henry Pitt, who would become our first archivist, when he was scoping the Lands and Survey Department for records for the archives back in 1918. He transferred records from the Land Office's cellar, which were in varying states of disrepair after being scattered across the cellar's floor, but the survey records remained where they were because they were readily accessible and well protected from damage by fire, damp and dust. They were also stored upstairs in the Surveyor-General's office. Pitt did note that these were significant, but he had to prioritise the damaged records because they weren't stored appropriately. He probably didn't anticipate exactly how long it would take for the archives to get these books, however. He reported on them on the 3rd of October 1918, and they were transferred on 18th of March 2022. If I've done my maths correctly, that's 105 years, 4 months, 3 weeks, and 1 day later. I'm going to end this paper with a bit of show and tell with some of the records transferred. Out of almost 5,000, I identified 4 items that I wanted to share. I probably only have time to share 1 or 2, but I'm just going to quickly run through. So this is a surveyor's field book, which looks like that. This is field book 73 in GRS 17911, which is the earliest government survey record in the collection and the earliest record transferred from this project. It dates from 8th of September 1836, which is 3 months before the proclamation of South Australia as a British province. It's technically an official government record that predates an official government. I was promised old records when I started on the project, but I've worked in government long enough to know that old normally means 1990s. So pre-proclamation old was beyond anything that I could have imagined. Its author was Assistant Surveyor Boyle Travers Finnis, who would go on to have a prolific public service career as Commissioner of Police, Police Magistrate, Colonial Secretary, Premier. He was actually our first Premier, and even acting Governor. Apart from its age and Finnis's authorship, what sets this book apart is that it is a rare example of an original handwritten survey record that dates from when Colonel Light was Surveyor-General. On 22nd of January 1839, a fire destroyed the Survey Office, Land Office and 2 houses, one of which was Colonel Light's. A number of official records were saved by staff on site at the time, but Light's personal belongings, including his journals, were notably destroyed. Light was a private surveyor by this time and no longer working for the colonial government, and the full extent of the records lost is not known. Light left an impression on South Australia, but not a lot of written records. Light artefacts are held in nearly every major collecting institution in the state. Adelaide City Council has 2 locks of his hair, one of which was donated by B.T. Finnis's daughter Julia. The Royal Geographical Society has roof shingles and loose bricks from Light's home in Theberton, which was demolished in 1926. One of the stranger items in the State Records collection is a doorknob from that same house. As well as the 1836 field book, there are at least 3 others by Finnis in the sequence. Field book 76 covers when he was in private business with Light, as well as when he was also Deputy Surveyor-General under Captain Charles Sturt. And the other 2 date from the 1840s, before he left surveying and became Commissioner of Police. The field books provided a very interesting lesson in determining original order. Chronologically, the first book is number 73, and you can see in the photo that it was labelled number 6, and underneath that label is actually labelled A. After more time researching than I care to admit to, I determined that the numbering system for all these books was introduced in around 1872. The first 600 were all back captured into that system at that time. The sequence is still used today for surveyors' field books, which now total well over 5,000, and it is arguably the longest running government records management system represented in the State Records collection. Although I was surprised and excited, elated even, to find such an old and significantly historical records in the office, these weren't a discovery. If it's in a catalogue, I can't have discovered it. These books were scanned a few years ago into the South Australian Integrated Land Information System, or SALIS, which is an online platform run by Land Services SA, and it covers land administration records and provides copies to the public. My excitement over these books waned slightly when I was told that full copies were already online. I didn't think to ask if any of the older records were scanned. Maybe I was being naive or overconfident, but I thought that I would have heard about them if they were online. It taught me a valuable lesson in not assuming too much about the records and how they were used, and to not promote anything as a discovery until I checked every single possible system first. I am confident in saying that this next book is a discovery, however. This book is book 3 from GRS 18001, which is topographical sketchbooks from the Surveyor-General's office. It looks very similar to the field books, and I had to rely on the covers and the contemporary register to tell the difference between them. These are actually a little bit unusual in terms of describing them appropriately. They're labelled topographical sketches. The 3 books in the sequence are field diaries, and this one is more of a rough notebook that only contains a single sketch, which looks like that. For the archival description, they are titled topographical sketchbooks, but with notes in the finding aids explaining that they are mostly notebooks. Book 3 was kept by Charles Hope Harris on a survey trip on Eyre Peninsula on 1874. While it doesn't contain the sketches it was supposed to, it does include very early references to original language from that area. They are a little bit hard to read, I'm afraid. They are in pencil. I noted these as a list of Aboriginal words as an interim description with the aim of looking into them further when the records were transferred. After discussing with our Aboriginal access officers, I contacted the mobile language team at the University of Adelaide to ask for their help in identifying the language and also to let them know about the record. I know I wouldn't expect to find an early Aboriginal to English dictionary in something labelled as a sketchbook, and I wanted to make sure that this was documented. The team works with Aboriginal communities with heritage languages, and their linguists confirmed that the survey noted in the book covered Gugatha, Wirangu, and Bangala country. It was pretty much right on the crossroads between those 3 communities. The languages noted are likely Wirangu or Bangala. There are place names scattered throughout the book which follow Wirangu and Bangala naming conventions and not Gugatha. One word that kept popping up was jumpapi, which the mobile language team think might be a well. Jump up means exist in Pidgin English, and uppy as a suffix denotes a place of water. So water exists. Oh well. At the time of writing this paper, digitised copies of this list are with the mobile language team for further investigation and research, and I hope to have the description updated shortly. As to what a list of Wirangu or Bangala words is doing in a sketchbook, or whatever you want to call this book, is down to Charles Hope Harris. Harris was very interested in what he referred to as native nomenclature and disagreed with giving places arbitrary English names, knowing that Indigenous names had meaning to the place, its natural state, and how the land was used. Harris specifically railed against naming places after whoever happened to be governor at the time or members of the viceregal party. The English name for the place he surveyed is the Gawler Ranges, which was named after the second South Australian governor, George Gawler. Incidentally, there is actually a lake in that area named Lake Harris, and it was named after Charles Hope Harris, but it wasn't named by him, it was just named for him. Out of all of the records I transferred from PLUS, this was probably the highlight for me. On the outside, it's not much to look at. It's plain and unassuming, but I think that makes me like it even more. It's a terrible analogy, but you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, especially when its cover says that it's a sketchbook. This list was discovered in the boxing and listing stage. If we didn't list every individual item and check every date range, it would have been described as a sketchbook, and we wouldn't have known about this incredible piece of history. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to have facilitated the transfer of thousands of interesting and historically significant records and to help make them accessible and findable, and especially to complete the work begun by George Pitt in the earliest days of the Archives Department. I'm also thankful for being able to work with a diverse range of people in PLUS and introduce them to archiving and hopefully assist with future transfers in the years to come. Thank you.